The courtroom buzzed with hushed conversation as people exchanged curious and skeptical glances. Darius, a young black teen no older than 16, walked in quietly, his shoulders squared but his eyes scanning the room nervously. He wore a simple hoodie and worn-out sneakers, an outfit that seemed to clash with the formality of the space. The whispers grew louder, some barely stifling chuckles as they eyed his appearance. To many, he looked out of place, a boy in a man's world. At the front of the room, Judge Wilkins adjusted his glasses, a faint smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. His robes hung stiffly as he leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Darius. The boy approached the defendant's table alone, clutching a few papers in his hand. No lawyer stood beside him. He set his papers down carefully, standing tall despite the judgmental stares around him. "You're representing yourself?" Judge Wilkins asked, his tone laced with amusement. He raised an eyebrow as if questioning the boy's decision. "This should be interesting." The prosecutor, standing confidently at his own table, chuckled softly, his arms crossed. He looked at Darius as though the case had already been won. To everyone in the room, the outcome seemed inevitable. A young boy, dressed like that, standing alone in court, how could he possibly stand a chance? But Darius didn't flinch. He met the judge's gaze with a calm, steady expression, his hands resting firmly on the table. The room buzzed with tension, but he remained composed, ready to prove that appearances could be deceiving. The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as the prosecutor stood, buttoning his suit jacket before addressing the judge. His tone was confident, almost smug, as he began his statement. "Your Honor, the evidence is clear," he said, gesturing toward Darius without so much as a glance at the boy. "This young man was found near the scene of the crime, graffiti on a government building, just minutes after the act was committed. He had paint on his hands, matching the colors used on the wall. Witnesses reported seeing someone of his description fleeing the scene. This is, without question, an open and shut case." Judge Wilkins leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, save for the slight twitch of amusement in the corner of his mouth. Adjusting his glasses, he looked down at Darius, standing alone at the defense table. The judge's tone was laced with sarcasm as he addressed the boy. "Are you sure you don't want a public defender, son?" he asked, his voice carrying a faint chuckle. "This isn't a school debate team." Darius didn't flinch. Instead, he met the judge's gaze with a calm, steady demeanor that was surprising for someone his age. His voice was firm but respectful as he replied, "No, Your Honor. I can handle this myself." A ripple of laughter swept through the spectators seated in the gallery. A few people shook their heads, whispering to each other as though they couldn't believe the audacity of the boy, standing alone in such a serious situation. One man in the back muttered, "This kid's got no chance." The prosecutor smirked, flipping through his papers with a satisfied air. He glanced at Darius, the confidence in his victory practically radiating from him. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "I'd like to present Exhibit A, photographs of the graffiti in question." He handed a folder to the bailiff, who passed it to Judge Wilkins. The judge flipped through the images, his eyebrows raising slightly as he examined the elaborate designs and bold lettering painted across the wall of the government building. The artwork, though illegal, was undeniably skilled. "Impressive work," Judge Wilkins remarked dryly, looking up at Darius. "If nothing else, it seems like you've got some artistic talent. Shame it's being wasted on vandalism." Darius remained composed, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. He waited until the judge returned his attention to the prosecutor before speaking up, his voice cutting through the murmurs in the room. "Your Honor, may I see the evidence?" Judge Wilkins glanced at him, mildly surprised by the boy's poise. He nodded, motioning for the bailiff to hand the photographs to Darius. The prosecutor smirked again, clearly unbothered by the request. Darius carefully studied each image, his sharp eyes scanning the details with precision. The room watched in silence, a few spectators leaning forward, as though trying to figure out what he was looking for. After a moment, Darius placed the photos neatly on the table and addressed the court. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I'll be able to prove that this evidence doesn't implicate me in any way." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, chuckling softly. "Oh, really?" he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "And how exactly do you plan to do that, young man?" Darius didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open to a specific page. The judge, curious despite himself, leaned forward slightly. "You'll find out soon enough," Darius said calmly, looking directly at the prosecutor. The crowd murmured again, some shaking their heads at what they perceived as arrogance, while others looked intrigued. Judge Wilkins held up a hand to silence them, his gaze fixed on Darius. "You seem confident, son," the judge said, his voice quieter now, tinged with a hint of curiosity. "But confidence won't get you far in here unless you can back it up." "Understood, Your Honor," Darius replied, his tone respectful but firm. The prosecutor's smirk faltered for just a second before he regained his composure. He motioned to continue, his voice cutting through the courtroom once more. "Your Honor, the facts speak for themselves. Paint on his hands, a match to the colors used, witnesses placing him at the scene. There's no reasonable doubt here." Darius remained silent, his calm demeanor unwavering as the prosecutor laid out the evidence. The room buzzed with quiet whispers, spectators speculating about how the boy could possibly defend himself against such damning accusations. Judge Wilkins tapped his gavel lightly to quiet the crowd, his eyes returning to Darius. "Well, Mr. Johnson," the judge said, addressing Darius by name, "you've heard the charges. Do you have anything to say before we proceed?" Darius stood up, his posture confident, but not defiant. He straightened the papers in front of him and looked directly at Judge Wilkins. "Yes, Your Honor," he said. "I intend to prove not only that I didn't commit this crime, but that the evidence presented is flawed. If you'll allow me, I'll start by addressing the photographs." The room fell silent, every eye on Darius as he prepared to take the first step in his defense. The boy who had been dismissed as just another troublemaker was about to show everyone that there was far more to him than met the eye. The prosecutor strode confidently to the center of the courtroom, gesturing toward the witness stand where a uniformed security guard sat. The guard adjusted his tie nervously, but maintained a composed expression. The prosecutor began his questioning, establishing the guard's credibility and his claim of having seen Darius near the vandalized government building. "Mr. Parker," the prosecutor began, "you were on duty the night of the incident, correct?" "Yes, sir," the guard replied, nodding firmly. "And you personally saw the defendant near the scene of the crime?" "That's correct. I saw him near the building and he had paint on his hands," the guard said confidently. The prosecutor turned to the judge with a satisfied look, as if the testimony had sealed the case. He glanced briefly at Darius, who sat calmly at the defense table, jotting notes in his notebook. The prosecutor stepped aside, motioning for Darius to cross-examine the witness. "Your turn," Judge Wilkins said, his tone neutral but tinged with curiosity. Darius stood, adjusting the cuffs of his hoodie as he approached the witness stand. His steps were deliberate, his posture confident yet respectful. The courtroom, which had been murmuring quietly, fell silent as everyone focused on the young teen. "Mr. Parker," Darius began, his voice steady and calm, "you testified that you saw me near the government building at 8:45 p.m., correct?" "Yes, that's correct," the guard replied, his confidence unwavering. Darius nodded thoughtfully, glancing at his notes before looking back at the guard. "But in your initial statement to the police, you said you saw the suspect at 9:15 p.m. Isn't that true?" The guard's face faltered slightly, his eyes darting to the prosecutor for reassurance. He stammered, "Well, yes, but I might have gotten the time mixed up. It was late and I—" "Thank you," Darius interrupted politely but firmly. So, your memory of the exact time is inconsistent. Would you say it's possible that you were mistaken about seeing me at all? No, the guard started, but his hesitation was clear. Judge Wilkins leaned forward slightly, resting his chin on his hand. His expression, once dismissive, now showed a flicker of intrigue. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, the spectators exchanging glances as Darius's calm, pointed questioning began to poke holes in the testimony. Mr. Parker, Darius continued, pressing further, you also stated in your report that the suspect was wearing a red hoodie. Do you see me wearing a red hoodie today? The guard hesitated, his eyes flicking over Darius's gray hoodie. No, but... And were there any other distinguishing features you could clearly identify about the suspect that night? Well, no, but... Thank you, Darius said again, his tone polite but assertive. He turned to the judge. Your Honor, the witness's testimony is inconsistent and unreliable. He cannot definitively place me at the scene of the crime. Judge Wilkins raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed by Darius's poise and logic. He glanced at the prosecutor, whose smirk had faded into a slight frown. Mr. Johnson, do you have anything further for the witness? The judge asked. Not at the moment, Your Honor, Darius replied, returning to his table. The prosecutor quickly stepped forward, trying to recover. Your Honor, even if the witness's timing was off, we still have physical evidence. Paint on the defendant's hands that matches the graffiti. Darius didn't flinch. He stood again, his calm demeanor unshaken. Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence to refute that claim, he said confidently. The judge motioned for him to proceed, leaning back in his chair with growing interest. Darius reached into his backpack and pulled out a USB drive, handing it to the bailiff. This is surveillance footage from a local store, Darius explained. It's time-stamped and shows me purchasing snacks at a location several blocks away from the government building at 8:45 p.m., well before the crime was reported. The gallery erupted into murmurs, the spectators leaning forward in their seats. The prosecutor's face tightened, and Judge Wilkins gestured for the bailiff to play the video. The screen lit up as the footage played. Darius walked into a small convenience store, browsing the aisles before purchasing a bag of chips and a soda. The timestamp in the corner read 8:43 p.m. The courtroom fell silent as the video ended. Darius spoke again, his voice unwavering. Your Honor, this footage clearly shows that I couldn't have been at the scene of the crime at the time the witness claims. The timeline simply doesn't add up. Judge Wilkins stroked his chin, his expression unreadable. He turned to the prosecutor. Do you have any explanation for this, counselor? The prosecutor stammered, flipping through his notes in a desperate attempt to find a rebuttal. Well, Your Honor, it's possible he returned to the scene later. Or, Darius interrupted calmly, it's possible that the real suspect hasn't been identified yet. All the prosecution has is circumstantial evidence and unreliable testimony. The judge held up a hand to stop the back and forth. He turned his gaze to Darius, his tone measured but impressed. You're building quite the case for yourself, Mr. Johnson, Judge Wilkins said. Please continue. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder again, but this time the tone had shifted. What had started as doubt and mockery was quickly turning into admiration for the young boy standing confidently in the face of overwhelming odds. The courtroom was silent, save for the faint rustling of papers and the occasional cough. All eyes were on Darius as he stood confidently at the defense table, ready to deliver his closing statement. He took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the room, meeting the eyes of spectators, the prosecutor, and finally, Judge Wilkins. Your Honor, Darius began, his voice calm yet firm. This case isn't just about me, it's about assumptions. From the moment I walked into this courtroom, I've been judged, not on the facts of the case but on how I look. I was accused because of where I was and because of who I am, not because of what I did. The audience sat frozen, many visibly moved by his words. Even the prosecutor, who had spent most of the trial looking smug, now shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Wilkins leaned forward slightly, his previously dismissive expression replaced with one of genuine interest. Darius continued, his tone growing more impassioned. The evidence presented against me relied on assumptions and inconsistencies. A witness who couldn't keep his story straight. Paint on my hands, which could have come from anything. But when I presented clear, undeniable proof that I wasn't at the scene of the crime, suddenly the narrative didn't hold up anymore. Why? Because facts don't lie. And neither do I. He paused for a moment, letting his words settle over the courtroom. The weight of what he was saying hung in the air, unchallenged. I didn't come here today just to clear my name, Darius said, his voice quieter now, but no less powerful. I came here to remind everyone in this room that justice should never be about who you think someone is. It should be about the truth. The silence was deafening as he finished. For a moment, no one spoke. Even Judge Wilkins seemed at a loss for words, his hands resting motionless on the bench. Darius returned to his seat, his head held high, as the judge glanced down at the case file in front of him. The courtroom's energy had shifted completely. What began as an atmosphere of doubt and mockery had transformed into one of respect and reflection. Judge Wilkins cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable as he reviewed the evidence one last time. His earlier smirk was gone, replaced by a furrowed brow and a faint frown. He realized now just how unfairly he had underestimated the boy standing before him. This court will recess for a short deliberation, Judge Wilkins announced, his tone subdued. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs as he stood and exited the bench, leaving Darius to wait in silence. After what felt like an eternity, the judge returned. The murmurs ceased immediately as everyone sat up straight, waiting for the verdict. Judge Wilkins adjusted his robe, cleared his throat again, and addressed the court. After reviewing the evidence and testimony, it is clear that reasonable doubt exists in this case. Therefore, the court finds the defendant, Darius Johnson, not guilty. The words hung in the air for a moment before the gallery erupted into murmurs and scattered applause. Darius exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his shoulders finally relaxing. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips as relief washed over him. Judge Wilkins, however, wasn't finished. He looked directly at Darius, his expression a mix of respect and curiosity. "Young man," the judge said, "I have to admit, I underestimated you. That was one of the most impressive defenses I've seen in this courtroom, and I've been on this bench for a long time." Darius stood, his composure still intact despite the emotions threatening to spill over. He nodded respectfully. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said quietly. The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the bench. "Where did you learn to argue like that?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his tone. Darius hesitated for a moment before replying. "I've been studying law on my own," he admitted. "I want to be a lawyer someday." Judge Wilkins's expression softened, a rare smile crossing his face. "You've got what it takes, son," he said firmly. "If you ever want to intern in my court, let me know. It would be an honor to mentor someone with your talent and determination." Darius's eyes widened slightly, the weight of the judge's words sinking in. He nodded, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "I'll think about it, Your Honor. Thank you." As the judge banged his gavel, officially closing the case, the spectators rose from their seats. Some clapped, others simply nodded in approval. For the first time, Darius felt truly seen, not as a suspect, not as a statistic, but as someone with potential. As he left the courtroom, his head held high, He knew this was just the beginning of his journey. As Judge Wilkins banged his gavel to officially close the case, the courtroom erupted into applause. The spectators, who had initially dismissed Darius as just another kid in over his head, now stood in awe of his composure, brilliance, and undeniable skill. Even the prosecutor, who had spent the trial smirking with confidence, clapped reluctantly, a look of begrudging respect on his face. Whispers of admiration rippled through the room as people turned to each other, marveling at the young boy who had just dismantled a seemingly airtight case with precision and calmness. The murmur of phrases like, "Can you believe that kid?" and "He's got a bright future ahead of him," filled the air as Darius packed up his notes, his hands steady and his expression resolute. As Darius walked out of the courtroom, head held high, several people approached him in the hallway. One older man reached out to shake his hand. "That was incredible, young man," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You've got a real gift." A woman leaned down, smiling warmly. "You should be proud of yourself. You have what it takes to go far." Darius thanked them quietly, a small but genuine smile spreading across his face. For the first time, he felt not just victorious, but validated, a glimpse of the bright future that lay ahead. A few years later, the doors of a prestigious law school swung open as Darius stepped inside, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. His once-worn sneakers had been replaced by polished shoes, but the determination in his eyes remained unchanged. He walked through the bustling halls with confidence, nodding at fellow students as he made his way to his first class. This was where he belonged. He had fought for this moment, and now his dream of becoming a lawyer was finally within reach. Elsewhere, Judge Wilkins sat in his chambers, scrolling through an article on his tablet. A headline read, "From Defendant to Law Student, the Young Man Who Defied the Odds." A small smile formed on his lips as he read about Darius's journey. He had once underestimated the boy, but now he saw what had been there all along, a brilliant legal mind destined for greatness. "I knew he had it in him," the judge murmured, pride evident in his voice.